Karoline Leavitt exposes a fake news reporter. The truth left everyone stunned. It was a bright, bustling morning when Karoline Leavitt entered the studio for the scheduled interview. She had always approached these moments with a sense of purpose, determined to speak the truth, no matter the environment. Today, however, she had a feeling that something was different. The room buzzed with energy as the production crew made their final adjustments. Karoline could hear the hum of the cameras being tested, the soft rustling of papers, and the distant chatter of the staff, all preparing for another live broadcast. Karoline, wearing a sharp but professional suit, stood at the edge of the stage, waiting to be called into the spotlight. She had been invited onto the talk show to discuss her political views, some recent legislative work, and the growing divide in public trust regarding the media. But she didn't know the host very well, and that was what bothered her. The host, Steve Hartford, was known for his dramatic approach to interviews and his propensity for stirring controversy. The more Karoline thought about it, the more she realized that he had a reputation for pushing boundaries, sometimes at the cost of truth. Karoline Leavitt, everyone, the producer called from across the room. Karoline took a deep breath and stepped forward, her shoes clicking against the floor as she made her way toward the set. As she passed the camera operators and makeup artists, she felt the weight of the situation settle in. She knew she could hold her own, but something about this particular interview felt different. She didn't know why, but her instincts were telling her that things wouldn't go as planned. The set was brightly lit, with a polished, modern feel. The audience had already taken their seats, eagerly awaiting the live taping. The familiar faces of the camera crew were scattered around, prepping for the segment. But it was the host, Steve Hartford, who immediately caught her attention. Hartford was known for his aggressive interviewing style, quick-witted, sharp, and occasionally underhanded. He was a seasoned journalist with a knack for making even the calmest of guests squirm. Karoline had seen his interviews before. He had a reputation for twisting words and creating drama. She wasn't sure what he had planned for her, but she wasn't about to let him catch her off guard. "Karoline, it's great to have you here today," Hartford said with a warm smile, extending his hand toward her as she approached the chair. "I've been looking forward to our conversation." Karoline shook his hand firmly, her smile polite but measured. "Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here." She took her seat, settling comfortably into the chair as the cameras began to roll. The lights were bright, casting a warm glow over the set, but Karoline's focus remained on Hartford. He sat across from her, his hands folded neatly in front of him, his expression one of casual friendliness. "So, Karoline," he began, leaning forward slightly, "you've made a name for yourself with some of your bold political positions. But there's also been a lot of debate about your views, particularly on the media and the way news is reported in this country. Some would say that you're a bit of a provocateur yourself. How do you respond to those critics?" Karoline's eyebrows raised slightly at the question. It was an unexpected start. Most interviews she had done began with light pleasantries or questions about her background, nothing this direct. She quickly composed herself, not letting the tone throw her off. "Well, I think it's important to have open conversations about these things," Karoline began, her voice calm and measured. "But the truth is, I've always been a believer in transparency. The media has a powerful role to play in our democracy, but when the narrative becomes more about sensationalism than truth, it undermines that role." Hartford didn't respond immediately. He studied her for a moment, a hint of something unspoken in his gaze. "You're talking about fake news, right?" he said, a slight smirk creeping up his face. "You've been very vocal about the so-called liberal media bias. But you know, not everyone agrees with you. Some people think you've taken that argument a bit too far. They would say you're just trying to discredit legitimate reporting." The tone had shifted. It was subtle, but Karoline noticed it right away. Hartford had just framed the conversation in a way that put her on the defensive, suggesting that her criticisms of the media were too extreme. She wasn't surprised. This was typical of his interviewing style. But Karoline wasn't about to play into the narrative he was trying to create. "I don't think criticism of the media is extreme," Karoline replied, her voice unwavering. What's extreme is when the truth is manipulated, misquoted, or outright ignored for the sake of a story. We've seen it time and time again, and it's damaging. I'm not here to attack journalists. I'm here to encourage them to hold themselves accountable. Hartford raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by her response. Accountability? So, you think journalists aren't being accountable enough? What makes you say that? Karoline's eyes narrowed slightly, sensing the trap. It wasn't just about asking questions anymore. Hartford was trying to push her into saying something that would make her seem overly critical or out of touch. I think some journalists have forgotten their responsibility to report the truth, rather than promote a certain agenda, Karoline answered, keeping her tone steady. But it's not just about blaming individual reporters. It's about a system that prioritizes clicks and views over accuracy and fairness. The audience was quiet, but Karoline could feel the tension growing. She wasn't sure where this conversation was heading, but she had a feeling that Hartford wasn't just interested in discussing her views. She had been invited here for a reason. He was setting her up, slowly but surely, for something more personal, more pointed. And as Hartford shifted in his chair, a subtle smirk returning to his lips, Karoline knew the game was on. The tension in the studio was palpable as Karoline sat across from Steve Hartford, his sharp gaze never leaving her. It was clear now that he wasn't interested in a typical discussion about her views or her work. No, Hartford had something else in mind. The way he leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as he pressed her, told Karoline exactly what kind of game he was playing. So, Karoline, Hartford began, shifting the conversation again, you've made some pretty bold statements about the media. You've accused some reporters of being fake news. But don't you think that undermines the work of journalists who are genuinely trying to report the truth? You've certainly taken issue with some of the most respected outlets. Do you really think they're all part of the problem? Karoline had been prepared for this kind of question. Hartford was trying to put her on the defensive, to make her look like someone who was quick to dismiss reputable journalism. The phrasing was subtle but designed to provoke. Karoline could feel the manipulation hanging in the air, but she didn't let it rattle her. No, Steve, Karoline responded, her voice calm but firm. I've never said that all journalists are part of the problem. I've criticized media outlets that knowingly misrepresent facts or present stories without proper context. There's a difference between being critical of certain practices and dismissing the entire profession. Hartford didn't seem satisfied with her answer. He leaned in closer, his voice lowering as if speaking to a child. But you do have to admit that the way you've attacked certain media outlets makes it look like you're just trying to discredit anyone who disagrees with you. And when you start labeling news as fake without providing clear evidence, it becomes very dangerous for public discourse. Aren't you just contributing to the problem? There it was, the accusation Karoline had known was coming. The insinuation that she was contributing to the very problem she was fighting against. Hartford was using language designed to make her feel isolated, to make her seem as if she were the problem, not the solution. Karoline's fingers subtly tightened around the armrest of her chair, but her face remained composed. I'm not discrediting anyone who disagrees with me, she answered slowly, making sure each word landed with purpose. But when false information is spread in the name of journalism, it damages the trust that the public has in the media. It's not just my opinion, it's something we've seen time and time again, especially in the age of social media. Hartford's eyes gleamed. He was relentless, digging in deeper. Oh, so now you're saying that social media is the problem too? You think that platforms like Twitter and Facebook are more trustworthy than legitimate news outlets, he said, his voice rising slightly, trying to make the distinction between traditional media and social media seem like a trap. Karoline remained steady. I think there are dangers in both, she said, her tone controlled. But the difference is that social media gives a platform to anyone with a voice, whether they have the facts or not. It doesn't make them right. The problem comes when media outlets do the same thing, reporting without verifying, sensationalizing stories for clicks, or, worse, blatantly fabricating information to serve an agenda. That's when trust in the media begins to break down. Hartford's smile widened, but it wasn't the smile of someone who had won an argument. It was the smile of a man who had just seen an opening. He had been waiting for this moment, and now he had it. With a slow, deliberate motion, he reached over and adjusted the papers in front of him, as though preparing for the grand reveal. "And yet," he said, his voice turning a little more pointed, "you've been very vocal in your criticism of certain reporters, especially those in the mainstream media. One reporter in particular, in fact, has caught your attention, Gregory Davis, a reporter from the New York Herald, who's covered some of your recent policies quite critically. But here's the thing, Karoline, there's been a lot of chatter online about your accusations. Some say you've attacked Davis because he's one of the few journalists who hasn't been afraid to call you out on your more controversial stances. And yet, you continue to attack his credibility. You've even gone so far as to call him fake news." The word attack hung in the air like a threat. It was as if Hartford was trying to paint her as a bully, someone who would silence anyone who disagreed with her. He was framing the conversation in a way that put her on the defensive, not just politically, but personally. Karoline felt her pulse quicken, but her expression remained unchanged. She knew exactly what Hartford was doing now. He wasn't just trying to challenge her views, he was trying to provoke her into reacting emotionally, to slip up. He wanted her to make a mistake. "Gregory Davis, the reporter you're referring to," Karoline said slowly, each word deliberate, "has a long history of publishing stories with significant factual errors. I've raised concerns about his credibility because time and time again, he's chosen to push a narrative over the truth. It's not about him calling me out, it's about him misrepresenting the facts. It's not personal, Steve, it's about holding the media accountable, something I've been advocating for from day one." Hartford wasn't backing down. "But what about the public perception of your attacks on him? It seems that your rhetoric is becoming more aggressive, and some even argue that you're doing more harm than good by engaging in these public feuds." Karoline paused, taking a breath. She could see where Hartford was going. The framing of this question was designed to make her look like a combative figure, someone obsessed with fighting against journalists instead of building bridges. He was portraying her as someone who was hurting her cause, and he wanted her to defend herself. But Karoline wasn't about to fall into that trap. "What's more harmful, Steve?" she asked, her voice clear and unwavering. "Having difficult conversations about the media's role in society, or allowing misinformation to spread unchecked because it's more convenient for a story?" For a brief moment, there was a silence. Hartford was taken aback by the directness of her response. It wasn't the kind of answer he was expecting. Karoline wasn't letting herself be caught in his web. She wasn't defending herself or her actions, she was speaking her truth. But before Hartford could respond, he shifted gears again, pressing even harder. "I'll tell you what, Karoline," he said, leaning forward, his voice now tinged with a sense of challenge. "You can say whatever you want, but at the end of the day, the question remains, are you truly trying to expose fake news, or are you just using the term as a weapon to undermine the credibility of anyone who dares to challenge you?" The room was silent. The tension was thick, as if everyone was holding their breath. Karoline could feel the pressure mounting, but she knew she couldn't let Hartford's tactics get to her. This wasn't about defending herself, it was about exposing the very thing she had come to challenge. Karoline sat tall in her chair, her hands resting calmly in her lap. The lights above seemed brighter now, the air thicker with tension as Hartford pushed for an answer he thought he could twist. It wasn't just about the issues anymore, it had become personal, and Karoline knew this interview wasn't about a fair exchange of ideas. Hartford wasn't interested in the truth, he was interested in a soundbite, a moment where he could make her look foolish or defensive. He leaned back, a knowing smile creeping across his face. "So, Karoline, you've made these bold accusations about Gregory Davis, but what if I told you that his credibility has been vouched for by some of the most respected figures in journalism? What if I told you that your claims of him being fake news have already been called into question by others who think you've crossed the line?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, but Karoline felt something shift within her. She had known this moment would come, where Hartford would attempt to turn the tables on her, casting doubt on her integrity in front of millions of viewers. It was exactly what she had expected. But what Hartford didn't know was that Karoline wasn't just playing along with the game, she was about to expose the real truth. She tilted her head slightly, her expression calm but deliberate. "You know, Steve," she began, her voice cool but steady, "you've been asking a lot of questions about Gregory Davis, but I don't think you've really asked yourself why someone like him is allowed to continue working with the kind of track record he has." Hartford's smile faltered for a moment. He had been so sure of his approach that he wasn't prepared for her directness. "What do you mean by that?" he asked, his tone shifting slightly, no longer the confident interviewer, but someone who was unsure of where this conversation was heading. Karoline's gaze hardened as she leaned forward slightly. "I'm not just talking about his reporting on me. I'm talking about his entire career. For years, Gregory Davis has been allowed to spread misinformation. He's been involved in one of the most notorious cases of journalistic malpractice this country has seen in recent memory. He's written multiple articles based on false sources, presented fabricated quotes, and has even been caught red-handed plagiarizing from independent journalists. But somehow, he's still considered a trusted figure in mainstream media." The room went quiet. Hartford blinked, momentarily stunned by the revelation. The audience, sensing the shift in tone, leaned in, their eyes wide as Karoline's words hung in the air. "Are you implying that he's a fraud?" Hartford asked, his voice edged with skepticism but clearly rattled. Karoline didn't hesitate. "I'm not implying anything, Steve. I'm stating facts. Gregory Davis has been exposed multiple times for dishonesty, and yet, the media refuses to hold him accountable. That's the problem with the so-called mainstream media. It elevates people like Davis because he's sensational. He creates controversy, and that drives ratings. But at what cost?" The atmosphere in the studio shifted. The tension in the air had reached its peak. The crew seemed to freeze, unsure of how to react. Karoline had just flipped the script. She wasn't just defending herself anymore, she was challenging the entire framework that allowed individuals like Gregory Davis to operate unchecked. Hartford, clearly flustered, tried to regain control. "Well, Karoline, I think it's important to remember that not everyone sees things the way you do. Many would argue that your criticisms are just a way to discredit anyone who challenges your narrative. So, what do you say to those people?" Karoline leaned back, her gaze unshaken. "To those people, I would say that the truth is nonpartisan. I'm not here to defend any narrative, I'm here to hold people accountable for the damage they do when they misrepresent facts. If you're a journalist, you have a duty to the truth. And when you knowingly distort that truth, you forfeit any claim to credibility." Her voice was firm, unwavering, and the clarity in her words made it impossible for anyone to ignore her message. She wasn't just exposing Gregory Davis anymore, she was exposing the systemic failure that allowed reporters like him to tarnish the integrity of journalism itself. Hartford, visibly shaken now, attempted to maintain his usual bravado. "So, are you telling me that you're going to take down every reporter who you don't agree with? You think you're the sole arbiter of what is and isn't credible?" Karoline smiled, but it wasn't a smile of amusement. It was the smile of someone who knew exactly what was happening. "No, Steve. What I'm saying is that there's a difference between disagreement and distortion. I'm not trying to take anyone down, I'm trying to make sure that the public gets the truth. And if that means exposing the lies of people like Gregory Davis, then so be it." The studio fell silent. For a moment, it felt like the world had stopped spinning. Karoline had just dropped a bombshell, and the ripple effect was already taking shape. The audience, the crew, the viewers at home, all were caught in the weight of her words. She had turned the interview on its head, from one where she was under fire to one where she stood as the voice of reason, the one exposing the lies that had been hidden for so long. Even Hartford, for the first time, seemed lost for words. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Karoline had just exposed the truth, and there was no denying it. The studio was buzzing with a palpable energy, but it wasn't the kind of energy that usually followed a lively debate or a witty exchange. This was different. The room was thick with tension, and the hum of the lights seemed to fade into the background as the reality of what had just happened set in. Karoline had just made a revelation that no one in the room had anticipated. Steve Hartford, the veteran journalist known for his tough, often antagonistic interviews, was caught in the web of his own tactics, and there was no easy way out. Hartford sat frozen for a moment, his face flickering between disbelief and confusion. The audience, once a sea of passive spectators, was now alive with whispers and murmurs. They could feel it. The entire narrative of the interview had shifted in an instant, and they were all witnessing something extraordinary unfold before their eyes. Karoline, however, remained composed, her demeanor calm as she watched Hartford struggle. She could feel the weight of the moment, but she wasn't about to let it faze her. She had known this day would come, the day when the manipulation of the media would be laid bare. But today, it wasn't just about her story. It was about everyone who had been subjected to the same dishonesty, the same distortion of truth. Steve Hartford cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Karoline," he began, his voice attempting to regain its former confidence, "I'm not sure if you fully understand the magnitude of what you just said. You're accusing a respected journalist of," he stumbled, choosing his words carefully, "of dishonesty, plagiarism, and malpractice." Karoline didn't flinch. "I understand exactly what I'm saying, Steve," she responded, her voice unwavering. "Gregory Davis has been called out before, but no one has had the courage to address it publicly. It's been swept under the rug, ignored because he's a so-called respected journalist. But the truth has a way of coming out, whether people want to hear it or not." The camera angle shifted slightly, capturing both Karoline's calm poise and Hartford's struggle to keep control of the narrative. The entire room seemed to hang on her words, waiting for the next move. The crew could feel the shift in the air, as the direction of the interview was now completely out of their hands. Hartford's mouth opened and closed a few times, but he couldn't seem to find the words that would diminish the truth Karoline had just revealed. "You're implying that everyone who follows Davis is complicit in this misinformation," he tried again, though it sounded weaker now. "Are you saying that the entire field of journalism is corrupt?" Karoline's eyes narrowed slightly, her response deliberate. "I'm saying that the system is flawed. I'm saying that when journalists prioritize their personal narratives or agendas over truth, they betray the very purpose of their profession. But that doesn't mean every journalist is part of the problem. The vast majority of reporters are still doing their best to serve the public with integrity. It's the few like Davis who undermine all of that." She looked directly into the camera as she spoke, her words now reaching beyond the confines of the studio. The audience, both in the room and at home, could feel the weight of the message she was sending. This wasn't just about one man. This was about a pervasive issue that went unchecked for far too long. As Hartford shifted in his seat, trying to maintain his composure, the effects of Karoline's revelation were already beginning to ripple through the media world. The interview was broadcast live, and within moments, the conversation had begun to shift on social media. Clips of Karoline's bold statements about Gregory Davis began to circulate, accompanied by the hashtag #ExposeFakeNews. The internet buzzed with reactions, some supportive, others critical, but all acknowledging the seismic shift in the narrative. Back in the studio, Hartford attempted a last-ditch effort to regain control. "You've made some serious accusations, Karoline," he said, his tone now defensive, "but where's your evidence? Where's the concrete proof that Davis is guilty of what you're saying?" Karoline sat back in her chair, exhaling slowly. "I've provided the evidence already," she said, her voice even. "Davis has been named in multiple journalistic integrity scandals, including plagiarism, misattribution, and even fabricating sources for sensational stories. The proof is out there for anyone willing to look." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the room. "And it's not just about this one reporter. It's about the fact that these incidents are often brushed aside or ignored because the media doesn't want to acknowledge the damage being done. It's time we hold journalists accountable for the harm they cause when they put their agenda ahead of the truth." The fallout was swift and unforgiving. Hartford, now visibly rattled, attempted to wrap up the interview, but Karoline wasn't finished. This isn't just about Gregory Davis, she continued, her voice cutting through the tension in the air. This is about a system that rewards sensationalism and ignores integrity. If we want real change in the media, we have to stop letting people like Davis go unchecked. It's time for accountability. The studio was silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. The crew moved quietly in the background, as if unsure how to proceed. Karoline had just exposed a deep flaw in the system, and no one knew how to recover from it. Hartford, still trying to regain his composure, glanced at the producer behind the camera, signaling that they needed to move on. But the damage had been done. As the cameras cut to a commercial break, Karoline stood up, her movements graceful and measured. She didn't look at Hartford as she left the stage. There was nothing left to say. The truth had been spoken, and it would reverberate far beyond the walls of that studio. Outside, her team was waiting for her, already monitoring the growing wave of reactions on social media. The hashtag #ExposeFakeNews was trending, and the articles about the interview were popping up on every major news outlet. Some were supportive of her bold move, others were critical, questioning whether she had gone too far. But no one could deny that Karoline Leavitt had shaken the very foundations of the media industry. As she left the studio, she knew the battle was far from over. The fallout was just beginning. But for now, she had done what she came here to do. She had exposed the truth. The aftermath of Karoline Leavitt's revelation had a ripple effect that spread quickly, far beyond the confines of the interview studio. The hashtag #ExposeFakeNews was now trending worldwide, and within hours, her words had ignited a firestorm of debate. Social media was alive with reactions, some praising Karoline for her courage, others attacking her for daring to expose a respected journalist. News outlets scrambled to cover the fallout, but the truth she had spoken couldn't be ignored. As Karoline left the studio, she could feel the weight of the moment. The interview had been a success, not just in terms of what she had revealed, but in how she had conducted herself. She had stood her ground against a seasoned interviewer, exposed the corruption within the media, and provided evidence that many had tried to bury. But the hardest part was still ahead. The fallout would continue to unfold, and now it was her turn to decide how to navigate it. In the days that followed, Karoline's team worked tirelessly to manage the storm. Her statements had prompted investigations into Gregory Davis's past, and the truth was starting to surface: stories from independent journalists who had been silenced, leaked documents, and interviews from former colleagues. The media industry was beginning to take notice, and for the first time, it seemed like the public's call for accountability was being heard. Yet, not everyone was on Karoline's side. Gregory Davis, of course, denied the allegations. His PR team issued a statement claiming that Karoline had misrepresented the facts and was trying to discredit his long-standing career. But the more they fought back, the more they seemed to dig their own grave. As journalists began to revisit Davis's past work, more inconsistencies emerged. The public could no longer deny the pattern of dishonesty that had followed him throughout his career. Karoline, however, remained resolute. She didn't seek the spotlight for the sake of attention, she wanted change. The public backlash wasn't surprising, but the truth had been spoken, and there was no going back. What mattered most to her was that people were now questioning the media in a way they hadn't before. One evening, as she sat in her office reviewing the growing response, Karoline's phone buzzed with a message. It was from a former colleague of Gregory Davis, a whistleblower who had worked with him years ago at a different outlet. The message contained a series of documents, internal memos, emails, and private communications that confirmed much of what Karoline had said on air. The truth was undeniable now. Karoline's team worked with a trusted group of journalists to verify the documents, and by the next morning, the story had broken. The evidence against Gregory Davis was overwhelming, and this time, there was no escape. News outlets began to retract previous statements made in his defense, and a broader conversation emerged about the consequences of journalistic malpractice. People were demanding reforms, accountability, and transparency in news reporting. The real victory, though, came when major media organizations began to make public commitments to investigate and audit their reporting practices. For the first time in years, there was genuine momentum toward change. The public wasn't just passively consuming the news anymore, they were actively engaged in holding the media accountable for the stories they told. Through all of this, Karoline never wavered. She had never intended for it to get this big, but now that it had, she was determined to see it through. This wasn't just about one reporter, it was about ensuring the integrity of the news that shaped public opinion and held power to account. Her commitment to the truth had sparked a movement, one that would take time to fully realize, but the seeds had been planted. In the weeks that followed, Karoline became a symbol of truth and accountability. Interviews came pouring in, and every major news outlet wanted her perspective. She refused to let the spotlight shift the focus away from the issue at hand, reforming the media system. But Karoline knew that the work was just beginning. Change, real change, would require continued pressure, continued exposure, and continued conversations. The final blow to Gregory Davis's credibility came when an independent review board, after conducting a thorough investigation into the allegations against him, released a damning report. He was permanently banned from writing for multiple prominent outlets, and several of his previous works were marked with corrections or retractions. Davis was now a pariah in the industry, a symbol of everything that had gone wrong with the media. But Karoline wasn't celebrating. Her mission was never about destroying an individual, it was about correcting a broken system. As the public began to demand better journalism, Karoline kept her focus on the bigger picture. She met with lawmakers to push for new media accountability laws and worked with grassroots organizations to encourage people to hold media outlets to higher standards. And then, one afternoon, as she was meeting with her team to discuss next steps, Karoline received a message that made her pause. It was from an anonymous journalist, someone who had been following her work and wanted to contribute to the cause. This journalist had uncovered a pattern of similar misconduct in other reporters, a network of unethical practices that spanned multiple media outlets. The work wasn't done. The media system was bigger than one reporter, one scandal. But Karoline Leavitt had ignited a spark that could not be extinguished. The truth had come to light, and now, the fight for accountability was in full swing.